Hey guys. Tonight's story starts with a creaking bedpost, a goat that definitely shouldn't be in the room, and a priest knocking on the door far too early for what's about to happen. You've woken up in a world where desire is tangled with superstition, passion comes with paperwork, and what counts as foreplay might involve a loaf of bread and 3 witnesses. There's no Wi-Fi, no dating apps, and absolutely no shame. Only rituals that make no sense, and people swearing they make the crops grow faster. And somehow, this is normal. Now, get comfortable. Let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You wake up to the sound of someone arguing with a goat. Not loudly, not violently, just persistently, like the goat owes them money and refuses to admit it. The straw beneath your back itches in a way that feels personal, like it's judging you. You sit up slowly, the wooden ceiling pressing close like it's in on a secret, and realize that the walls around you are made of what could generously be called timber, and more honestly be called someone's leftover fence. Sunlight drips through the cracks like gossip through a keyhole. Somewhere outside, a woman is singing about turnips in a voice that makes the turnips seem vaguely ashamed. Your clothes are coarse and unfamiliar, and the blanket wrapped around your legs smells faintly of onions and stronger of someone else's feet. There's a bowl on the ground near the door. You think it might be soup or water or a failed experiment in porridge. Either way, it's steaming and unattended, which in this village apparently means free. You take a sip. It's none of the things you hoped, and several of the ones you didn't. It tastes like boiled wood and decisions made in haste. The door swings open without so much as a knock, mostly because there's no latch to knock against. A boy no older than 12 marches in, nods at you with the authority of a tax collector, and says, "They said you're not allowed to stay if you don't participate." He doesn't clarify participate in what, but his tone implies that refusal comes with consequences, possibly goat-related ones. You follow him outside, squinting against the sudden light and the smell of fresh manure having an identity crisis. The village is already awake, though awake might be too generous a word. People shuffle more than walk, yawn more than speak, and the chickens look suspiciously well-informed. The cottages are low and huddled, leaning into each other like drunk uncles, and the streets are more mud than path. Still, there's a rhythm to it, a quiet kind of chaos, like a party thrown by accident and then maintained out of sheer obligation. You pass a cottage where the shutters are open wide, and a couple is arguing about bedding in full volume while folding said bedding in the street. No one stops to listen because everyone already knows what the fight is about. Last week she accused him of hiding oats in the rafters. This week it's something about how many candles count as excessive. A woman with a face like a walnut and hands like she invented bread herself stops you mid-step and asks, "You joined yet?" She doesn't specify what. You hesitate. She cackles and shuffles away. You notice she's wearing 3 aprons, and none of them are hers. The boy leading you gestures toward the square, where a group has gathered around a large wooden post. It looks ceremonial in the way a spoon can look ceremonial if enough people pretend. A man in a faded robe, probably a priest or someone impersonating one successfully, is holding a scroll with the sort of gravitas normally reserved for oaths or good cheese. He begins reading aloud, his voice dipping and soaring like it's trying to avoid potholes. It's a list of who's allowed to sleep with whom, when, and under what lunar phase. Tuesdays are out, Sundays are sacred, and if the crops fail, it's likely your fault for not following the correct position during equinox. Several villagers nod solemnly. One sneezes into a cabbage, and a goat nearby eats part of the scroll. No one stops it. You glance at a couple standing nearby, arms linked, faces blank. When the priest mentions their names, they raise their hands like they've just won something. A cheer goes up. Someone hands them a loaf of bread. Someone else throws flower petals. And then someone else shouts, "Get on with it," which apparently is the cue. The couple is ushered into a small room adjacent to the square. The door remains half open. A woman with the expression of a tax auditor steps inside with them, holding a candle and a notepad. You do not ask questions. Witnessing is a sign of trust, says the boy beside you, nodding. We rotate shifts, builds community. You stare at him. He offers you a beat. You do not take it. Every window in the village seems to have a line of sight to the room. Some people are already preparing commentary. A man with a jug leans back like he's settling in for theater. A dog sits beside him, ears perked. Privacy, you realize, is not a right here. It is a myth, a polite fiction no one bothers maintaining. Here, the body is public, desire is documented, and love, if it exists, is as likely to be witnessed as the weather. You turn, trying to find a corner that isn't occupied by a knowing glance or a curtain that flutters a little too conveniently. A rooster on a nearby fence watches you with something close to pity. You nod back. It feels appropriate. Welcome to the village. Close the door if you want. Just know, they'll still hear everything. You're standing in a room that smells like boiled wool, wilted herbs, and the kind of anticipation usually reserved for a public hanging or a really aggressive game of charades. The bed is in the center, raised on a platform like it's about to make a speech, and every creaky floorboard echoes like judgment. There are chairs lined up along the wall, most of them already occupied by people holding mugs, lanterns, or thinly veiled expectations. You spot the baker, the blacksmith, two shepherds, and a woman who might be your new wife's second cousin, or possibly her midwife, or possibly both. It's unclear. The village priest is there too, blinking solemnly and holding a leather-bound book he hasn't opened yet. He clears his throat more than he speaks. Your bride is beside you, wearing a dress that was definitely white once, and a facial expression that says she's strongly considering hiding under the bed or setting the place on fire. Her hands are folded so tightly, it's unclear where her knuckles end and your future begins. She whispers something to you that sounds like, "Don't say anything stupid," which feels both fair and tragically optimistic. The priest steps forward with the slow inevitability of someone who's had to do this too many times and has emotionally checked out somewhere around the third sheep blessing of the season. He raises his hands and begins to speak in a tone usually reserved for weather updates and minor plagues. The words are familiar, mostly because you've heard them shouted across the village square at least once a week since midsummer. There is something about union, something about fruitfulness, and something about right and proper witnessing, which makes the older woman in the second row nod so hard her bonnet slips sideways. When the priest finishes, there's a brief moment of silence, heavy with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, everyone will now leave and let the two of you get on with it in peace. That hope is shattered immediately when someone rings a tiny brass bell and three people begin humming. Not in tune, not to a melody, just humming. One of them is chewing. You try not to think about what. Your bride turns to you, face unreadable. You give her a look that you hope says, "This is insane, but I will try not to make it worse." It probably says something closer to, "I'm deeply sorry about my elbows." A woman steps forward holding a folded sheet with the gravitas of a diplomat presenting a treaty. She hands it to you with a nod that implies this is a sacred relic and not something that smells faintly of mildew and onions. You unfold it and lay it across the bed. There is polite clapping. You're not sure why. The bed creaks dramatically under your combined weight, like it has personal objections to what's about to happen. The priest mumbles a blessing over a candle. Someone in the audience sneezes. Someone else starts knitting. The blacksmith leans forward as if watching a particularly tense dice game. The pressure is not romantic. It's administrative. You lie back awkwardly, one foot still on the floor, unsure of what counts as acceptable movement. Your wife turns to you and whispers, "If you say anything poetic, I will smother you with this sheet." You nod. It's the closest you've come to intimacy all day. After a long silence filled only by the sound of your own heartbeat and someone loudly slurping soup, the priest coughs. "We'll give them privacy now," he says, which is clearly a lie. The crowd stands, stretches, and files out with the enthusiasm of people leaving a particularly disappointing puppet show. Someone takes the soup with them. The candle is left behind. So is the pressure. The door shuts with a click that echoes through your bones. You lie still. So does she. You both start laughing at the exact same time, quietly, hysterically, like people who've just survived something absurd and are still technically in danger. The candle flickers, the bed sighs, and outside the door, someone whispers, "They're laughing. That's a good sign." It might be. You're not sure yet, but it's yours now. You wake to the sound of arguing, not shouting exactly, more like two people quietly panicking over whether or not blood counts if it lands mostly on the floor. The words are hushed, frantic, and full of the kind of anxiety usually reserved for tax audits or unexpected visits from nobility. Through the paper-thin walls, you hear the priest sigh in a way that makes it clear this is not his first failed sheet inspection. The bed is still warm beneath you, your new spouse snoring softly beside you, with the absolute serenity of someone unaware that their bodily fluids are now a matter of public concern. You sit up slowly, unsure of which part of your body will be called upon to testify next. The sheet is bunched around your waist like an accomplice trying to avoid the constable. You glance down. You see fabric, linen, possibly wool. Definitely nothing resembling definitive proof. A knock at the door, not a polite knock. "We're coming in whether you like it or not" knock. You barely have time to cover the more interesting bits with the ambiguous sheet before the door creaks open, and in walks the priest, the midwife, and, regrettably, the miller's wife, who you're fairly certain is only here for the drama. They approach the bed like it's a crime scene, which, in a way, it now is. The midwife lifts the sheet delicately, like she's inspecting fine lace, and not the remnants of your very first legally sanctioned encounter. She sniffs, audibly. Her face does something between a wince and a smirk. "No sign," she says flatly, and the priest rubs his temples like he's praying for a lightning strike. You consider offering to reenact the entire event, but something tells you that suggestion would not be received in the spirit of helpfulness. There's a moment of silence, and then the miller's wife leans forward with the predatory grace of a cat that's seen a mouse blink. "Well," she says, stretching the word until it nearly snaps. "Maybe the act didn't happen after all?" You open your mouth, then close it again. Technically, it did. It just didn't leave behind the correct evidence. You're not a scholar, but you're fairly certain love isn't supposed to come with a blood quota. The priest mutters something about doctrine and shame, and how none of this would be an issue if people just married goats, like in the old days. You think he's joking. You hope he's joking. The midwife folds the sheet with military precision and places it into a basket. You have no idea where it's going, only that it's being taken somewhere official. You imagine a stone room filled with similar linens, all catalogued and judged by candlelight, and feel your stomach turn. "We'll have to ask the council," the priest finally says. "They'll want a statement." The idea of giving sworn testimony about your night under oath while your in-laws nod from the pews makes your soul physically shrink. Later, in the square, you sit on a bench while villagers stroll by pretending not to stare. Your spouse sits next to you, nibbling on a radish with the unbothered air of someone who has decided to let chaos simply pass through them. You try to match the energy, but your hands keep twisting in your lap like they're trying to undo time. A boy approaches with a bundle of fresh linens and hands it to you without comment. He runs off before you can ask if it's a gesture of support or a request for a second attempt. Probably both. You hear a whisper behind you, something about witches and impotence, and maybe a curse, and turn just in time to see two elders pretend to be very interested in a nearby duck. The council will convene at dusk. Until then, you are in marital limbo, floating somewhere between official and questionable, wrapped in anxiety and suspicious thread count. No one told you the most sacred part of marriage would come down to laundry. You're woken at dawn by a rooster that sounds like it's losing a bet. Outside, the village is already alive with the kind of energy that usually means something terrible is about to happen, like a festival involving fire or a tax collector with a clipboard. Your new spouse is still asleep, one arm flopped across your face in a gesture that feels both affectionate and slightly vengeful. You shift gently, sit up, and immediately notice the bucket of dirt at the foot of the bed. It is not explained. It never is. You step outside and the air smells like wet bark, sour milk, and ambition. The baker is muttering to himself while forming bread into vaguely human shapes, and the apothecary's apprentice is arguing with a goat about boundaries. At the center of the square stands the priest, who has begun tying red ribbons to a wooden post with the enthusiasm of someone who definitely isn't qualified for any of this. Apparently, it's fertility trial day. This is told to you by a child holding a chicken upside down and a turnip in his other hand, which you're beginning to suspect is the village's version of a formal invitation. You're escorted to the edge of the field, where the soil is thick, wet, and slightly judgmental. A circle of villagers has already formed, most holding baskets of items that make no sense until someone starts listing them off like ingredients in a poorly conceived curse: eggs, a piece of burnt bread, a tiny wooden spoon, and something that might be a very old sausage. The priest calls for silence. He raises a book that might be a Bible or a tax ledger and begins the ritual with the phrase, "In the name of fruitful loins," which is somehow both hilarious and terrifying. You are handed a clump of soil and told to speak to it kindly. You try. You say things like, "You're good at what you do," and "I believe in your nutrients," while someone behind you snorts into their tunic. Next comes the bread. Not to eat, of course not. That would be far too normal, but to place beneath the bed tonight as a sign of nourishment and, according to the miller's wife, to tempt the spirits of conception. You are warned not to. Nibble it, even accidentally, or the entire ritual resets, and you have to start over during the next full moon, which involves significantly more nudity and cold river water. A pig is brought forward. You are not told its role, only that it must be present for at least one full verse of the fertility chant. The pig seems unconcerned. You are not. The priest begins humming. Everyone else joins in, including a man who can't find the key and chooses to invent one instead. Your spouse takes your hand, squeezes once, and whispers, "Just pretend we're planting turnips." You nod, though you're not sure how much turnips usually involve chanting and eye contact with livestock. The ritual peaks with the throwing of flower petals into the wind. Yours hit a cow. This is apparently good luck. Afterward, there's a short feast, though no one eats much. It's mostly an excuse to stare at you both like you're about to sprout twins on command. Several women offer you herbs. One insists on smearing ash across your forehead. You accept everything with the resigned grace of someone who knows there's no such thing as dignity in ceremonial mud. Night falls, and the bread is tucked gently beneath the bed. The sheets are fresh. The pig has gone home. You lie beside your spouse, staring at the wooden ceiling, wondering if this is what hope looks like in this village superstition and breadcrumbs. You almost laugh. Almost. Because the thing is, it just might work. You arrive at the square just as someone drops their tunic during a spin and doesn't seem in a rush to retrieve it. The morning sun glints off thighs that have never known shame, and the drummer, shirtless, glistening, and likely named something like Ulrich, pounds his rhythm with the fervor of a man who believes sound itself might get someone pregnant. Around you, the village is in full bloom. Flowers, ribbons, flutes, and entirely too many knowing smiles. Children run past with wreaths in their hair, trailing laughter and sticky fingers. Someone throws a loaf of bread. It's unclear whether this is celebratory or romantic or just poor aim. You duck anyway. This is the fertility festival, or as the priest calls it, an affront to modesty wrapped in debauchery and figs. His sermon this morning was longer than usual, filled with words like temptation and corruption, and that one parable where a man loses his goats, and somehow it's the woman's fault. No one listened, mostly because the drummer started warming up halfway through, and Sister Agnes dropped her hymn book when she saw the dancers stretching. The dancers, for their part, are not here to redeem themselves. They move in circles, hands clasped, legs bare, hips rolling like they've been practicing in secret barns. Their costumes are more idea than fabric shreds of linen, garlands of ivy, beads that clink in suggestive rhythm. Every movement is a prayer, apparently, but not the kind you'd say in church unless you were hoping to get kicked out. You lean against a cart of slightly bruised apples and watch as a woman with hair down to her hips lifts a man by the waist and spins him in place like he's made of barley and wishful thinking. The crowd cheers. A small old man claps like he's seen a miracle. Someone behind you whispers, "That one's going to be fertile for sure," and you're not entirely sure whether they mean him or her or both, or maybe the earth itself. Your spouse finds you and hands you something on a stick. It might be honey. It might be cheese. It might be a very bold experiment in food preservation. You eat it anyway. It drips on your shirt. You decide it's part of the costume now. From the edge of the crowd, the priest watches like a man standing in the middle of a thunderstorm, trying to shame the rain into going back up. His knuckles are white around his staff, and his mouth is doing that thing where it tries to frown in multiple directions at once. Beside him, the altar boy is pretending not to tap his foot in time with the music. The dances become more elaborate as the sun climbs higher. Partners switch, then they don't. Then they do again, but slower. A circle forms. A young couple is lifted into the air on a blanket, while others chant something about harvest and strong thighs. A goose runs through the crowd, panicked and possibly aroused. No one stops it. You ask someone if this is allowed. They snort and hand you a drink that smells like firewood and rebellion. It's tradition, they say, as if that explains anything. Later, the priest will attempt a counter-sermon in the middle of the square. He'll raise his voice, wave his book, and shout about damnation. A dancer will kiss his cheek mid-turn, and he'll drop the book into a basket of pears. No one will return it. As the day wears on, the line between sacred and scandalous blurs like heat rising off cobblestones. The music pulses. The villagers laugh louder, dance closer. You feel it in your chest, a humming, a pull, a wildness that has nothing to do with sin and everything to do with being alive in a body you didn't ask for, but now must carry with something like joy. And through it all, the church bell rings, distant and ignored, like a warning shouted across a festival that's already decided it's worth the risk. The first time you see it, you think it's armor. Not elegant, shining, dragon-slaying armor, but something more industrial. Like if a blacksmith tried to make underpants after a bad breakup. It glints beneath the woman's hemline as she stoops to adjust a goat harness. A flash of iron in the morning sun, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal complaining about its purpose. You try not to stare, but your curiosity has always been stronger than your manners. The woman straightens, sees your expression, and gives you a look that says she's seen that face 100 times, and it never ends with intelligent conversation. She nods toward the bench. You sit. She lifts her skirts not in a seductive way, but in the practical, no-nonsense style of someone about to show you something unfortunate. And there it is, a tangle of buckles and clasps and rivets, all wrapped around the most vulnerable geography imaginable. It's not subtle. It's not even symmetrical. The padlock alone looks like it was borrowed from a barn door. Chastity belt, she says, as if you've just asked what bread is. You nod slowly, resisting the urge to ask where the key is, and more importantly, who decided this was a normal thing to attach to a person. She shifts, and it creaks. Somewhere deep in the device, a hinge squeals like it's tired of this job and wants a new career. They say it protects virtue, she adds, rolling her eyes. Mostly, it just pinches. You learn quickly that hers isn't the only one. At the well, 3 women are discussing rust prevention techniques. One recommends vinegar, another swears by beeswax. The third says she hasn't removed hers in 7 years, and frankly, she's grown attached. Not emotionally, just physically. There's talk of scar tissue. No one flinches. A younger girl struts past with a belt polished to a blinding shine and tiny bells sewn along the waistband. She looks proud, like a peacock that's just learned metallurgy. Behind her, an older woman mutters something about foolish jingles and how nobody with a belt that loud has anything worth protecting. The men aren't much better. Some speak of the belts with awe, others with discomfort, and at least one with open envy. I tried to fashion one for myself. He confesses to you over a cup of something that tastes like burned moss, but the angles were all wrong. Nearly lost a toe. You discover that chastity belts are not mandated but heavily encouraged. The priest gives sermons with titles like Iron Wills and Iron Locks, full of metaphors that do not survive close examination. The local blacksmith, who now refers to himself as a guardian of virtue, has a new booth at the market where he offers fittings, upgrades, and an engraved model that promises aesthetic integrity with spiritual reassurance. There's a wait list. You ask cautiously if anyone actually enjoys wearing them. Responses vary. One woman clutches her belt like a badge of honor and says it's kept her safe from wandering hands and worse intentions. Another says it's the only thing between her and a marriage to the baker's apprentice, who once referred to her ankles as tempting morsels. A third woman whispers that she only wears hers in public and keeps a copy of the key under the chamber pot, just in case a miracle happens. And then there's the woman with the limp. No one talks about her much, but everyone notices. Her gait is uneven, her temper sharper than most, and her belt is rumored to be sealed with a key that was thrown into a lake after a heartbreak that left a small scandal and a large puddle of regret. She never confirms it, but when she walks past, even the goats step aside. That night, you lie awake, thinking of hinges and locks, and the strange ways people try to manage desire. You imagine metal biting into skin, not to restrain, but to signal virtue, control, ownership, fear. Maybe all of it. Outside, an owl hoots. A latch clicks in the dark, and somewhere nearby, iron shifts softly against flesh. The healer's hut smells like boiled socks and ambition. Bundles of dried herbs hang from the rafters, swaying like they know too much, and every surface is cluttered with jars labeled in handwriting that wavers between mysterious and illegible. You're not entirely sure how you ended up here. Something about a recommendation, something about your recent lack of enthusiasm, and something else muttered too quickly to understand. The healer is already grinding something in a mortar the size of your head. She hasn't asked what you need. She simply looked at you, squinted, and said, "Ah, lust." You try to object, but she waves a hand dismissively and drops 3 angry-looking nettles into the bowl. They twitch slightly, which seems like a bad sign. Then comes a spoonful of honey, dark and sluggish, and something else, a powder that shimmers for half a second and then disappears entirely. She doesn't name it. You don't ask. "This'll open the heart," she says, stirring the concoction with a twig. "And the thighs, if the stars are right. You consider leaving. The door is right there, framed by hanging strings of garlic and what might be squirrel tails. But you don't leave, because part of you is curious, and part of you is desperate, and the rest of you is already holding the mug she presses into your hand. It's warm. It smells like old books and bee stings. You take a sip. It burns your throat, not with heat, but with indignation. Your eyes water. You sneeze once, twice, a third time that nearly knocks your hat off. The healer nods approvingly. Means it's working. You're not sure what it's working on. Your sinuses, probably. Your nose runs in a way that feels both undignified and vaguely romantic. Back outside, the sun seems too bright, and everyone's face is too expressive. The blacksmith winks at you in a way he hasn't before. You wave awkwardly. A passing shepherdess gives you a flower and says nothing. Your spouse, when you find them, tilts their head and asks why you smell like pine tar and determination. You try to explain. You fail. Words are harder now, or maybe you're just too aware of everyone's lips. By mid-afternoon, you're unsure whether the potion is inspiring passion or just paranoia. Every glance feels loaded, every brush of a sleeve electric. You watch two pigeons fighting over breadcrumbs and feel vaguely scandalized. At supper, you drop your spoon twice and accidentally call your spouse my delicious mistake, which earns you a raised brow and a suspicious amount of silence. You excuse yourself and sneeze into the stew pot. Later that night, you lie in bed vibrating slightly. The air is full of possibility, and your sinuses are completely clear. Your spouse watches you cautiously, then slowly slides a hand across the blanket. Are you all right? You nod too fast. Did you drink something? You nod again. Was it glowing? You hesitate, then shrug. They sigh and roll onto their side. Just don't try to sing again. You're not seducing anyone with that nasal situation. You agree. In theory. But your dreams are full of firelight and whispered promises in languages you don't know. And when you wake up tangled in the sheets, you're holding a daisy and humming something suspiciously melodic. The potion doesn't wear off so much as shift. Over the next few days, you stop sneezing, but you start noticing things. The curve of a wrist, the sound of laughter in the rain, the way hands brush against loaves of bread like they mean it. You blush at soup. You compliment strangers on their ankles. You become known, briefly, as that one who makes everything weird. Eventually, it fades. Life returns to normal, mostly, but every now and then, you still catch a scent, honey, herbs, and that nameless shimmer, and feel your heart stumble like it remembers something wild. You never ask what the final ingredient was. You're not sure you want to know. It starts with a candle. Not for light, not for mood, but because it smells like clove and sandalwood, and someone insisted it helps keep the demons confused. You're not entirely sure if that's a metaphor, or if there are actual demons. But either way, you're sitting on the edge of a bed that creaks like it knows what's coming and disapproves. Your spouse is beside you, trying to read instructions that were written in Latin and emotionally repressed sighs. Across the room, the village cleric is humming. He claims he's not technically part of the church, which is apparently how he gets away with things, like this rituals that involve bare skin, sticks made from blessed ash, and vigorous applications of theology to the lower back. They call it the cleansing of carnal shadows. You call it what it is, light spanking. You're told it's ancient, sacred, some tangled knot of old superstition and spiritual theory, where the body's pleasure is meant to lure out hidden evils, and the sting of discipline sends them back into the ether. You ask how demons got in there to begin with. The cleric simply raises an eyebrow and starts oiling a switch. The switch, to be clear, is not menacing. It's slim, polished, and smells faintly of lavender. It's the sort of thing you might use to stir a delicate stew or threaten a disobedient parsnip. Still, you are not eager to be its stew or its parsnip. The ritual begins with prayer. Not the quiet, hands-folded kind, but something more theatrical, chanting in a key that doesn't exist, with syllables that sound like they were invented by someone sneezing into a scroll. The cleric sways. Your spouse hums along. You try to look supportive while keeping your body angled protectively away from the ash switch. Then comes the invocation of purification. You are instructed to breathe deeply, think pure thoughts, and bear a specific region of flesh that shall remain undescribed for the sake of your dignity and the reader's lunch. The air is warm, the candle flickers, and suddenly the room feels very small. The first strike is more of a tap, a ceremonial suggestion, a polite knock on the door of your soul. You flinch anyway. The second one is more confident. By the third, you're wondering if the demons inside you are just as startled as you are. Your spouse watches intently, possibly for signs of spiritual release, possibly to make sure the cleric isn't enjoying himself too much. You're not sure if you're supposed to moan, or repent, or recite a psalm. Instead, you sneeze again, and no one is sure what that means. The cleric continues, switching rhythm and switching switches. This one made from birch, that one from willow. Each has a name, each has a purpose. You're not clear on either, but you nod when appropriate and bite the pillow when not. At some point, the candle goes out. No one relights it. By the time it's over, you're a little sore, oddly lightheaded, and very aware of the draft in the room. The cleric bows, thanks the spirits, and collects a modest donation, which you're fairly certain was not optional. Your spouse helps you up, eyes shining, and declares you remarkably exercised. You both sleep strangely well that night. Whether it's the demons leaving or the adrenaline crash is hard to say, but you wake up with a sense of calm and a very symmetrical welt across one cheek. At breakfast, the healer pats your shoulder and whispers, "You look holier," which is deeply unsettling coming from someone holding a root shaped like a screaming face. Word spreads, as it always does. Within days, 3 more couples have booked sessions. A 4th asks if they can bring their own switch. A 5th offers to observe. For research, you try not to judge, you try not to make eye contact, especially with the cleric, who now greets you with a wink and a hand gesture that could mean peace or paddle. You're not sure which is worse. It begins with a mask, not a delicate, mysterious one, but something bold and lopsided, made of painted bark and feathers that keep drifting into your mouth. It smells like old hay and newer mistakes. Someone ties it behind your head with a ribbon that may or may not have been used to bind last year's pig for roasting. No one seems concerned. The square is already buzzing, full of music that can't quite decide on a tempo and dancing that stopped trying to follow rules 2 goblets ago. Laughter spills through, the air like wine that missed its cup. Everywhere you look, there are masks, some elaborate, some frightening, some clearly made in the last 8 minutes. People move like they've already forgotten their names and are thrilled to meet themselves again for the first time. This is the feast of fecundity, or as the older folks call it, that one weekend we don't talk about in church. You were warned. In the way people warn you about mild thunderstorms and overeating. You were told it was a celebration of spring, a tribute to the land's bounty, a symbolic union of flesh and field. You were not told about the nudity, or the goat painted gold, or the specific smell of honey mead mixed with horniness and bad decisions. Someone shoves a wooden cup into your hand. It tastes like berries and fire. A masked woman with ivy in her hair dances past and pinches your rear. You yelp. She laughs. No one reacts, which is somehow worse. At the center of the square, a bonfire roars to life, fed by logs, old furniture, and a pair of pants someone apparently no longer needs. Around it, the crowd tightens, sways, breaks apart, and reforms like a drunken tide. A man in a deer mask lifts his shirt and howls. Someone responds from the rooftops with a yodel. You begin to suspect this entire festival was designed by committee after drinking paint thinner. You lose your spouse in the crowd. Or maybe they lose you. Either way, you're suddenly being led by the hand into a dance that involves more hip contact than choreography and ends with you nose to nose with a stranger who smells like cloves and opportunity. Good for the wheat, they murmur, before vanishing into the mist. A bell rings. No one knows where it came from. A cheer erupts. You cheer too, just in case it's mandatory. Somewhere behind you, someone is reciting a blessing in rhyming couplets. Ahead of you, 2 people fall into a haystack with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for rescue missions or cake. You don't see your spouse again until just before dawn. They're barefoot, flushed, and holding someone else's hat. You're wearing a necklace made of bread and carrying a potato that might be symbolic or might just be a snack. You both stare at each other, then burst out laughing. No one talks about what happened. Not directly. The morning after is for water, apologies to your liver, and silently sweeping glitter out of your underthings. But the baker leaves heart-shaped rolls on your doorstep. The apothecary gives you a wink and a tiny bottle labeled, "just in case." And the priest spends the entire next sermon pretending he doesn't smell like bonfire and fermented pears. By week's end, life returns to its usual rhythm. Plows move through soil, chickens resume their judgmental clucking, couples walk hand in hand, pretending their blushes are from the sun, and beneath it all, the land waits fed not just by rain and compost, but by laughter, longing, and the strange, hopeful magic of anonymous masks, and a harvest that, somehow, always comes. You've just finished your morning bread when the neighbor's wife knocks on your door, holding a candle shaped like something you can't unsee. She asks if she can borrow your hearth for a blessing of potency. You tell her yes, mostly because you're too stunned to say anything else, and because you've already learned that in this village, curiosity is both social currency and a survival skill. She sets the candle on the stone, lights it, and begins to chant. Not in Latin, not in anything that sounds remotely approved by anyone in a robe, but in a sing-song patter that includes phrases like, "May his knees hold strong, and grant thine servant a bounce most unyielding." You lean in. She offers you a line to repeat. You do. The candle sputters like it's embarrassed. Apparently, this is for Saint Guarin, patron of the unflagging husband. There's a plaque to him in the chapel, tucked discreetly behind a curtain near the bell ropes. You found it once while looking for somewhere to hide from Brother Marius's 3-hour sermon on moral restraint. The saint is carved mid-stride, robes billowing, gaze lifted toward heaven with an expression that can only be described as determined lust and light dehydration. The locals take him seriously, very seriously. You learn that there are other saints too, each with their own peculiar specializations. Saint Begonia, who watches over wombs and window boxes. Saint Drogo, not to be confused with the one for coffee houses, but invoked for endurance and flexibility. And Saint Euphemia the Unruffled, whispered to by wives whose husbands return from the tavern full of inspiration but short on technique. The prayers are creative, borderline poetic, and sometimes include anatomical diagrams scratched into the dirt with a stick. You attend a fertility mass where a monk tries to keep a straight face while reading a request for fruitful loins, rhythmic hips, and merciful quiet from the geese next door. The congregation nods solemnly. One old man weeps. You can't tell if it's from reverence or memory. One evening, you're invited to a bedroom blessing, which you assume is a euphemism. It is not. It's a literal ceremony performed in a literal bedroom, with incense, linen soaked in wine, and a small figurine of Saint Ferald balanced precariously on the headboard. The couple kneels, while a woman in a shawl, possibly a midwife, possibly just very confident, circles them, muttering a list of qualities desired in a child. Thick hair, good teeth, pleasing disposition, manageable feet. You sip something warm and murky while pretending this is a normal Tuesday. What strikes you most is the sincerity. No one's laughing. No one's smirking. These are prayers offered like seeds, hopeful and a little desperate, rooted in tradition older than most of the walls in this village. There's a belief here that heaven listens more carefully when you're out of options and slightly drunk on mead. Eventually, you find yourself doing it too, mumbling to St. Olwyn under your breath while trying to impress your spouse, lighting a candle for St. Piora the patient when they take too long getting undressed. You feel ridiculous at first. Then, somehow, you don't. One night, as thunder rattles the shutters and your bodies tangle in a mess of limbs and laughter, you think you hear something creak in the corner. It might be the old chair. It might be divine approval. Either way, you light a second candle just in case, not because you believe in miracles exactly, but because it's nice to think someone, somewhere, is rooting for you. Even if they're made of wood and smell faintly of thyme, you're halfway through watching two peasants fumble their way into a hayloft when someone recites a poem about longing so intense it makes your ears sweat. The contrast is abrupt. Below you, two people are elbow deep in each other, making noises that suggest either extreme passion or mild injury. And above them, perched on a crate like a brooding owl, a boy in a velvet tunic clutches a scroll to his chest and sighs like the wind itself has wronged him. He is a squire. He has written 17 stanzas about the curve of a wrist. You know this because he reads every one of them to you. The poem includes metaphors involving moonlight, doves, and somehow a weeping fig tree. He insists it's about purity. His boots, meanwhile, are crusted with evidence that he hasn't been near a bath in 3 weeks. You try to pay attention. You really do. But the hayloft couple groans again and dislodges a rake. It crashes down beside you, narrowly missing your foot and smashing a pail full of what you hope is water. The poet doesn't flinch. He's too committed to his sonnet cycle of chaste fire. This is courtly love, you've been told, a noble tradition. It's about admiration from afar, desire unconsummated, a slow burn that never becomes flame. You've also been told that it's extremely fashionable among the upper class and absolutely ridiculous to everyone else. In the village, love is loud, fast, and usually involves mud. Couples grab what moments they can between chores, behind barns, sometimes in barns. Passion is practical. A good pairing is based on warmth, humor, and whether someone can carry a pig and still flirt convincingly. In the keep, love is a pageant. Knights pledge loyalty with embroidered favors and joust for glances. One baroness spends 3 weeks sighing over a knight who once helped her off a horse. He's married. She doesn't care. She writes him letters folded into swan shapes and sends them via a child with sticky fingers and no sense of timing. At dinner, you watch a lady stare longingly at a man 3 seats down while her husband loudly discusses turnip yields. She drops her spoon. The other man picks it up. They do not touch. The tension is so thick it could be churned into cheese. Back in the village, a woman dumps a bucket of apples on a man's lap and calls it foreplay. He looks thrilled. They disappear behind the mill and return with matching bruises and huge grins. You begin to wonder if anyone truly enjoys this noble version of love, or if it's just another way for people with too much time and not enough privacy to feel interesting. One lord composes a ballad so elaborate it requires 3 lutes, 2 viols, and a child trained in interpretive gesture. The subject of the song is his wife's cousin. No one comments. Meanwhile, the baker and the brewer's daughter are engaged after locking eyes over a steaming batch of rye and deciding collectively that this was good enough. You live between these 2 worlds now. You listen to rhymed anguish by moonlight and witness enthusiastic coupling by daylight. You are both amused and deeply confused. One evening, the poet corners you, again. He has a new piece, this one about a single moment of almost hand-touching at a midsummer feast. It is exactly 300 lines long and ends with the phrase, "And thus I burn." You smile politely, and then you go find your spouse behind the shed, where they are waiting with a grin, a jug of something fermented, and absolutely no interest in metaphors. You've never been so relieved. The first thing they do is close the shutters. Not to give the couple privacy, no, that would be ridiculous, but to keep the pigeons out. Apparently, last year, one landed on the bride's ankle mid-act and was mistaken for a sign from St. Malchus. The church is still arguing about what it meant. You are seated on a bench that smells like damp wool and generational trauma. Around you are 5 other witnesses, an elderly knight who keeps nodding off, a midwife with the composure of someone who's seen it all and wishes she hadn't, a priest who is sweating profusely, the bride's aunt who brought embroidery to keep her hands busy, and you, who were just trying to borrow a jar of pickled beets and somehow ended up part of a sanctioned bedroom tribunal. This is trial by consummation. Not a metaphor, not a euphemism. It's exactly what it sounds like. A legal requirement for noble marriages, designed to prove that the union has been, how did they put it, flesh welded in the eyes of God. The couple enters the room, dressed in linens so stiff they rustle like scrolls. They look pale. The bride grips a sprig of rue like it's a weapon. The groom looks like a man about to confess to crimes he hasn't yet committed. They do not make eye contact with each other, or with you, or with anyone. The priest begins the ceremony with a long prayer that includes phrases like fruitful joining and blessed mingling of humors, which makes it sound like they're about to brew tea instead of, well, each other. When he finishes, he places a candle on the nightstand and gestures like a man presenting an oven for inspection. No one leaves. You are not allowed to. The couple climbs into bed with the solemnity of martyrs. The bride lies back with all the enthusiasm of someone waiting for a dental procedure. The groom removes one sock, then the other, and then remembers he is being watched and promptly drops both. The midwife clicks her tongue. The aunt drops a stitch. The priest clears his throat. What follows is not dramatic or graceful. There is some fumbling, a great deal of blanket rustling, and one brief moment where the groom's elbow knocks over the candle. The knight wakes up just long enough to mutter, "Again?" The midwife lifts the sheet precisely 1 inch to verify contact. You stare intently at the floor, which is covered in rushes and regret. A goat bleats somewhere outside. Eventually, there is a pause, a finality. The midwife nods. The priest exhales. The aunt claps quietly and then immediately apologizes. You consider clapping too, but settle for a discreet thumbs up no one sees. There is no cheering, no congratulations, just a subtle shift in the room, as though a weight has been set down and carefully walked away from. The couple dresses behind a curtain. The groom exits first, face flushed with the strange triumph of someone who has survived something profoundly ridiculous. The bride follows, chin high, clutching her dignity like a prized turnip. You are given a small piece of bread and a sip of wine as thanks for your service. You don't know what to say, so you say nothing. Outside, the world continues. Chickens peck at the dirt. A child throws a stick at a fence and misses. Someone somewhere is making soup. You walk home in silence, unsure what part of you has been changed. Later that night, your spouse asks how your day went. You open your mouth, close it, and finally say, "I need stronger wine." It starts with a sheep, specifically a sheep wearing a garland of marigolds and what looks like a ceremonial bell that's far too heavy for its delicate neck. It stares at you as though it knows something you don't, which is unnerving because you've just been told to touch it for good luck. You ask what kind of luck. The old woman in the shawl taps her nose and says, "The kind that fills cradles." Then she winks. The sheep sneezes. You're not sure who to trust anymore. Apparently, in this village, animals aren't just animals. They're symbols, gateways, mysterious, mooing middlemen between barren bellies and bountiful broods. There's a whole hierarchy to it. Sheep are for twins, goats for boys, hens for swift conception and, allegedly, pleasing hips. No one explains what the ducks are for. You don't ask. The healer keeps a book filled with notes and sketches that look like someone tried to summon fertility through poultry. There's an entire page devoted to intimate proximity, with livestock defined, thankfully, as sitting nearby, whispering your wishes into their ears and offering them bread soaked in herbs. You are deeply relieved that it doesn't go further. Then someone brings up the cow, not just any cow. The cow, big, dappled, revered. Her name is Melisende, and she has her own stall, draped in ribbons, with a plaque that reads, "Blessed be she who moos at the moon." You assume this is a joke. It is not. Couples visit her before trying for children. They brush her back and murmur sweet nothings, then leave small tokens, a button, a sprig of rosemary, occasionally a lock of hair. One man swears his triplets were a direct result of Melisende licking his elbow. Another claims his daughter was born with a birthmark shaped like an udder. You begin to suspect that people here just really want to believe in something, and if that something happens to be a celestial cow with a taste for lard biscuits, so be it. Still, the rituals don't stop at admiration. There's also the matter of sleeping near animals. Fertility by osmosis, they call it. You're not sure osmosis works that way, but last night you saw a couple dragging a straw mattress into the pigsty. This morning, they emerged, flushed, giggling, and covered in something that might have been joy or manure, possibly both. One man builds a shrine out of chicken bones and eggshells. Another walks backward around a goose pond 7 times while singing about virility in a minor key. The blacksmith's wife ties a ribbon around a donkey's tail and names it after her mother-in-law, then claims the spell only works if you don't laugh. You fail, spectacularly. You try to stay out of it, but eventually, someone hands you a kitten and says, "Hold it," while thinking about legacy. You do. The kitten bites your thumb and purrs. The old woman beams like something sacred has just occurred. You're not convinced, but you're not entirely unconvinced either. The line between belief and bedtime story blurs here. People know it's ridiculous. They also know that sometimes it works. Maybe not because of the animals, maybe because ritual gives shape to hope, and hope is its own kind of magic. Or maybe the cow really is blessed. At this point, nothing would surprise you. You go home that night and tell your spouse about the kitten, the sheep, the man who swears he impregnated his wife after eating a duck egg laid during an eclipse. They listen quietly, then hand you a candle shaped like a rabbit and say, "Just in case." You light it. You don't pray. But you do glance toward the barn and wonder if Melisende is accepting visitors. It begins with silence. Thick, stone-walled, candle-lit silence, the kind that hums in your ears and makes you feel like you've wandered into a sacred secret or someone's extremely awkward dinner. You're inside the monastery's cloisters now, surrounded by men in robes who look like they've spent a lifetime swallowing their own thoughts. You are not supposed to be here. That much is clear. But Brother Odo said they needed help with the root cellar, and curiosity, as always, has ignored all social etiquette and barged right in. At first, the monks seem as austere as their walls. Heads bowed, lips stitched in solemn piety, hands folded like origami prayers. They murmur Latin like it's a love language whispered only to God. You nearly believe it, until twilight falls. That's when the silence frays. One by one, the monks retire to their cells, small rooms with wooden beds, unlit candles, and, if you're being honest, terrible acoustics. And yet, it's precisely then that the walls start whispering back. The confessions are quiet, barely above a breath. You're passing down the hall, carrying a basket of turnips, when you hear it. "I touched Brother Clement's wrist and liked it." You pause. Not for gossip, just for survival. There's something about being near this kind of honesty that makes you hold your breath like it might be contagious. In the next room, someone is weeping softly. You catch phrases between sobs, dreams of her mouth, and "damnation be gentle." You've never moved vegetables this slowly in your life. They all took vows of silence, of celibacy, of lives lived above temptation. But the truth of flesh is not so easily shut away. It seeps in through cracks in stone and under doors at night. You learn that Brother Roland writes erotic hymns on parchment scraps and then burns them before sunrise. Brother Alaric carves a woman's name into his walking stick and tells everyone it's a saint. They talk to you sometimes, not directly, not in daylight, but in passing moments. They drop words like pebbles into a well and walk away before the splash. "I think my body still remembers her," one says as he stirs the communal soup. "I pray harder when I fail," says another, chopping onions too forcefully to be about onions. There's a tunnel beneath the herb garden. You're not supposed to know it exists, but you follow a flickering candle one evening and find it lit all the way to the edge of the woods. There are footprints in the mud, 2 sets, returning. You do not follow them. In the chapel, there's a painting of St. Agnes, eyes turned skyward, holding a lamb. One monk polishes it every morning with the tenderness of someone remembering a lover's cheek. He hums as he does it, the same tune, over and over. You ask what it is. He says it has no name. One night, you find Brother Odo in the library, clutching a book with the kind of grip usually reserved for rope bridges and confessions. He tells you that temptation isn't the sin, it's the silence after, the pretending it never happened. He looks older than he did yesterday. You don't know what to say, so you hand him a candle and say nothing. The monastery smells like wax and guilt. Still, there's a kind of peace to it. Not the peace of purity, but of persistence. These men stumble, falter, dream in forbidden colors and wake anyway. They bake bread. They mend sandals. They plant lavender in crooked rows and pray, not always because they believe, but because they hope belief might come back if called often enough. You leave the monastery a week later. Brother Alaric hands you a loaf of bread shaped like a heart. For your journey, he says. He does not explain. You bite into it an hour later, alone on the road. It tastes like rosemary and the things we are never brave enough to want out loud. You weren't supposed to find the garden. It's tucked behind a wall draped in ivy so thick it rustles like gossip, and the entrance is a crooked little archway that looks like it leads to a tool shed. But it doesn't. It leads here, to a place scented like roses, rosemary, and something you can't name but feel all the way down in your bones. The air tastes like secrets. The nuns call it the bride's walk, but no one explains who the bride is or what she's walking toward. You get the sense that asking would be like throwing a stone into a baptismal font possible, but deeply frowned upon. Inside the convent, silence is an art form. It isn't empty, it's crowded, pressed thick with all the words that want to be spoken but get swallowed instead. The sisters glide through the halls like shadows in veils, their eyes soft and unreadable, their hands forever busy with thread or dough or folded prayer. You try to match their rhythm, but your feet keep making noise, like your very soul creaks. They smile at you, though. Not all of them, just the ones who have been here long enough to stop caring about the rules, but not long enough to forget why they came. On your second day, you witness Sister Magda whisper sweet nothings to a statue of Christ. She doesn't notice you, or maybe she does and doesn't care. Her words are tender, almost breathless. There's a longing in them that makes you feel like you've read a diary left open too long. You back away before she starts kissing the feet, but just barely. The chapel holds a painting of Christ as a groom. You've seen it before in books, but up close, it's unsettling. His expression is gentle, yes, but also knowing, like he's heard every confession and is still waiting for you to tell the real one. Above the altar, gold letters proclaim, "Spouse of the Soul," and it doesn't sound nearly as metaphorical as you thought it would. You learn quickly that in this place, marriage isn't a worldly bond. It's divine, eternal, personal. Each nun is wedded to Christ. There's even a ceremony for it. White gowns, candles, rings, everything but the awkward uncle making toasts and someone tripping over a goat. The first time you attend one, you think it'll be all solemnity and incense, but Sister Therese is radiant in a way that isn't just spiritual. Her hands tremble as she makes her vows, and when she accepts the ring, her lips part like she might cry, or laugh, or both. Afterward, she disappears into herself for hours. No one says where she is, no one knocks. Desire doesn't die here, it just gets redirected. Sister Beatrice writes poetry, flowing, fevered things that mention thorns and silk and divine embrace more often than seems appropriate. She claims, therefore, personal reflection. You find one stuffed into a hymnal and feel like you've intruded on a bedroom. They talk about ecstasy, but it's not just the saintly kind. There are stories, old ones, about saints so overwhelmed by divine love they collapsed, trembling, cheeks flushed, mouths open and gasping hallelujah. You start to understand that, in this place, the body isn't denied, it's reframed. It becomes the altar, the offering, the medium through which love, capital L, terrifying, holy love, is both endured and invited. At night, you hear humming, low and soft through the stone. A lullaby, a chant, or maybe just someone remembering what touch felt like and trying to sing it back into existence. One evening, Sister Agnes offers you tea brewed with herbs you've never seen before. She says they calm the spirit and open the heart. You ask if that's code for something. She smiles like she knows you're not ready to hear the answer. Before you leave, they let you sit in the garden one last time. A breeze brushes your face like a kiss withheld too long. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls. Not for prayer, for evening vows. You look up at the stars. You don't speak, but something in you feels spoken to. You arrive expecting a hearing. What you walk into is more of a performance. The courtroom isn't the grand stone chamber you imagined, with solemn monks and echoing judgment. It's a converted barn that still smells like hay and disappointment. There's a table, a few stools, and a magistrate who looks like he's been chewing the same piece of bread since sunrise. Behind him sits a clerk, scribbling with the grim intensity of someone who's already seen too much. And then there's the accused. He's not in chains. That would imply a crime. He's in something worse, shame. A tunic 2 sizes too small, a flush creeping up his neck, and a pair of trembling hands that can't decide where to rest. His name is Guy, or maybe it's Giles. You miss the introduction because you're still trying to process the phrase the bailiff just used, trial of virility. You thought that was a metaphor. A metaphor would be kinder. His wife stands across the room, arms crossed, chin lifted. She looks like she's swallowed a righteous thunderstorm and plans to let it loose the second she gets the floor, which she does, loudly, with phrases like, "Hasn't touched me in 2 years, and the candle shows more life." The magistrate listens, nodding slowly, eyes closed as though absorbing the words through osmosis. Then he sighs and gestures to the corner of the room where a curtain hangs limply on a makeshift rod. "It's time for the test. You want to leave. You are not allowed." Something about being a citizen witness. Whatever that means, it apparently comes with front row seats to a deeply personal tragedy. Guy or Giles disappears behind the curtain with an attendant, a jug of wine and instructions. You hear rustling, muttering, and what sounds like someone praying with increasing urgency. It goes on for a while, long enough that you start counting ceiling beams. Eventually, he emerges holding a cloth, a very small cloth. The clerk takes it solemnly, like it's evidence in a murder trial. The magistrate sniffs. The wife snorts. You stare at the floor and wish it would open up and swallow you whole. A midwife is brought in to interpret the results. She examines the cloth, asks 2 questions, and then declares, with the finality of a lightning strike, inconclusive. Which means you all get to do this again tomorrow. The next day, a new witness is introduced. A healer with an herbal salve that smells like mint and regret. She applies it while humming a song about oak trees and virility. The room grows very quiet. Behind the curtain, there's more muttering, then silence, then a thud. You choose not to ask. This time, the cloth is less cloth and more theoretical. The midwife frowns. The magistrate leans forward. The wife begins to weep, dramatically, into a handkerchief that's far too clean to be real. By the 3rd day, no one is pretending this is anything but torture. The magistrate looks bored. The clerk's ink pot is nearly dry. The healer has run out of salves and started recommending prayer. And poor Guy, deflated in more ways than one, stares blankly at the wall as if trying to unsee his own life. Eventually, the court declares him unfit for marital duties. The marriage is dissolved. The wife leaves with a smirk and a goat. You're not sure what the goat has to do with anything. You don't ask. You pass him on your way out. He doesn't speak, just nods once, like a man who has fought a battle no one should ever have to name. Outside, the air feels too open, too bright. You look up at the sky and realize that some trials leave no visible scars, just quiet ones, buried. You walk home slowly. Every step a prayer of gratitude that today, at least, your own name wasn't called. You're not entirely sure how you ended up on the wrong side of a wooden fence, listening to a priest explain the ecclesiastical lunar calendar with the kind of intensity usually reserved for military campaigns and cheese-making. But here you are. There's a parchment in his hand, a wild look in his eyes, and a goat chewing disapprovingly behind him. 365 days in the year, he says, tapping the parchment like it personally betrayed him, but only 56 suitable for the act. He doesn't say what the act is. He doesn't need to. Your neighbor Gerald tried to petition for an exemption once. His wife had a fondness for Tuesday evenings. Apparently, Tuesday evenings fall right between St. Wilfrid's Vigil and the Feast of Perpetual Sorrows, which means absolutely not. Gerald tried anyway. Now he walks with a limp and avoids candles. It's not that the church is against intimacy. In theory, it's fine as long as it's for procreation, done in the dark, and everyone looks vaguely ashamed before, during, and especially after. But there are rules. So many rules. You're handed a scroll the length of your arm and told to plan accordingly. Sundays are out, of course. So are Wednesdays and Fridays, being fast days. 40 days of Lent are strictly off limits. So are Advent, Pentecost, and any major feast day that involves a martyr, a miracle, or a fish. Add to that the moon phases because apparently a waxing crescent invites temptation, and you're left with a handful of evenings scattered across the calendar like crumbs from a very nervous biscuit. One of those days arrives at last. A sanctioned, soul-safe evening. You light a candle. Your partner has washed behind their ears. The bed has been fluffed. Spirits are cautiously high. Then the bells toll. You freeze. Outside, Brother Linus is shouting something about St. Cuthbert's bones being paraded through town. You blow out the candle. The moment wilts. The next week, you try again. This time, you've double-checked the lunar chart, the saint's roster, and even consulted old Maud, who has a sixth sense for holy interference. All is clear, until a messenger gallops into town screaming about a spontaneous pilgrimage and a last-minute fast. You watch the window, blanket pulled to your chin, as villagers chant and light incense. Your night, once again, is sanctified into submission. There's a rumor, probably false, but whispered with hope, that if you make a sufficiently large donation to the church, the bishop will forget to count certain feast days. But last time someone tried it, the donation box mysteriously caught fire, and the bishop claimed it was divine retribution for thinking God could be bribed with turnips. One woman in town claims to have cracked the code. She keeps a secret ledger hidden behind a loose brick and schedules everything with military precision. Her husband walks around like a man who's seen heaven and lived to tell the tale. You ask her for advice. She just winks and mutters something about tides. Eventually, you stop asking. You learn to enjoy the unpredictability, to find romance in the margins. A shared glance in the market, fingers brushing over lentils, whispered promises that may or may not be postponed by Saint Hubert and his overly enthusiastic commemorations. One afternoon, you overhear the priest updating the parish schedule. Due to a clerical error, he says, St. Ulrich's feast has been moved to next week. You laugh a little too loud. He doesn't appreciate it. Later that night, under a sky with no festivals, no fasts, and no bones being paraded, you take your partner's hand and shut the door softly. The candle flickers. The parchment calendar lies folded on the table, for once, blissfully ignored. And outside, the moon simply shines, waning, indifferent, and beautifully unsupervised. You don't mean to get involved. Really. You're just passing through the square on your way to fetch onions and possibly avoid a man named Thomas who keeps insisting the two of you are spiritually betrothed because you once made eye contact during Lent. But then you hear shouting, and where there is shouting, there is usually something you shouldn't see but absolutely will. The crowd's gathered like crows around a shiny object. At the center of it all stands Marta, a weaver's daughter with one eyebrow perpetually arched and a talent for reciting psalms with suspicious confidence. She's holding a chicken, not by the neck, but like it's a handbag. You've seen stranger things, just not this early in the week. Opposite her is old Gerald, who is pointing with the unsteady conviction of a man who has recently sniffed something stronger than communion wine. He's yelling something about sorcery, deception, and how his heart has been bewitched, which is quite the declaration coming from someone who once tried to marry his cousin's goat. Twice. The accusation, it seems, is this. Marta has stolen a lock of Gerald's hair questionable enough, given that he only has 3 remaining, and hidden it beneath her mattress. According to Gerald, this constitutes undeniable proof of witchcraft. According to Marta, it constitutes cleaning up after he passed out in her workshop and drooled on a spindle. A friar is called to mediate. He arrives breathless, carrying a bell and looking like he just lost an argument with a beehive. He asks for silence, and then, as is customary, begins the inquiry by blessing the chicken. It flaps its wings once, dramatically, as though aware it's now part of something far more absurd than usual. The evidence is presented. A suspiciously short hair, a piece of twine, and a note that reads, "May he dream of me." Marta explains, not unreasonably, that it's just a bit of playful poetry. The friar nods as though poetry is already halfway to sin. Gerald then produces a list of symptoms. Heat in the loins, he says, to no one's delight. Visions of her face in the butter churn. And most damning of all, a persistent twitch in my left knee when I hear her name. The crowd murmurs. Someone sneezes. The chicken poops. Marta, ever composed, says she did tuck the note under her mattress, not for witchcraft, but because parchment's expensive and she didn't want it stolen. She says the hair was collected in a comb, the twine was from her mother's sewing kit, and the twitch in Gerald's knee is more likely from dancing barefoot in the frost last solstice to impress a barmaid with uneven eyes. The friar rubs his temples and asks if she has consorted with demons. She blinks and says she once shared a prayer mat with her cousin's ferret, which honestly doesn't seem relevant. There's a silence. Then Gerald starts to cry. It's not dignified crying. It's the kind of weeping that ends with hiccups and confessions about unmet expectations and how he's always wanted someone to sing his name while stirring stew. Marta looks like she might feel bad for him, but then the chicken bites her finger, and the moment passes. The verdict? Inconclusive sorcery. Suspicious behavior. Strong recommendation of cold baths and scripture. No burning, no branding. Just an awkward handshake and a formal apology written on the back of a spoiled tithe receipt. Later, you pass Marta at the well. She's humming. The chicken's gone. She sees you watching and lifts her chin with the weary grace of someone who's survived both heartbreak and poultry litigation. You nod. She nods. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleats ominously. And you think, maybe, love itself is the real magic, or at least the most convincing excuse for nonsense. You never meant to walk in on anything. You were looking for mushrooms, not metaphorical ones, not some local euphemism. Actual mushrooms, because dinner is thin tonight and you'd rather not gnaw on another root pretending it's stew. You take the long path near the mill, because the moss grows thick there, and maybe you'll finally spot the pale speckled ones. Old Maud swears taste like roasted duck if you squint and chew fast. That's when you hear it. A breathless noise. Not pain, not joy. Something more delicate and more dangerous. Curiosity pulls you forward before common sense has a chance to argue. They're in the grass, hidden by the slope, but not well enough. Two men, tangled in a closeness that would be ordinary if one of them weren't wearing the carved brooch of the town reeve, and the other wasn't the baker's second son. You freeze. They don't see you. For a moment, the world goes silent except for the wind and the rise and fall of their quiet, stolen happiness. Then a branch cracks. You don't know if it's you or the universe itself. But the moment shatters, and with it, so do they. By the next morning, it's not a secret anymore. Someone talks. They always do. The reeve is nowhere to be found. The baker's son is dragged to the square by his collar like a sack of flour that's offended someone. He doesn't speak, doesn't plead, just stands there with a stillness that makes your skin crawl. The punishment is swift, and it's ugly. No questions, no trial. The church has spoken, and what they've spoken is fire and shame. He's lashed in public, forced to confess with lips cracked from thirst, while the crowd stares and the priest reads verses with the tone of someone reciting a recipe. The same crowd that once bought his cinnamon rolls now throws pebbles, like that somehow balances the scales. You don't see the reeve again, not until weeks later, when he's found face down in the river, his fine brooch gone, his boots tied together with twine that wasn't there before. It's not just that. It never is. The girl from the tannery caught with the blacksmith's wife in the hayloft is sent away, for reflection, they say, which you know means a convent far enough to be forgotten. A farmer's daughter, swollen with a merchant's child, is forced to stand barefoot before the altar while her family chants penance with the blank eyes of people who've practiced detachment like a hymn. Desire here isn't a secret. It's a sin with a price chart. You hear stories of other towns where punishment comes with cloaks of silence, where shame is quieter but no less cruel. Some use stocks. Some use exile. One, they say, buries offenders up to their waists and leaves them for the crows, unless a prayer or a bribe comes first. You ask once, just once, why it matters so. How much who loves whom, who touches what, where the line is drawn, and who gets to hold the chalk. The priest looks at you like you've suggested turning wine into vinegar. It's about order, he says, God's design. But the design seems to leak. Cracks form in whispered corners, in glances held too long, in palms that brush a second longer than allowed. People pretend. Pretending becomes tradition. You start walking the mushroom path less often. Not because of what you saw, because of what they did afterward. You keep your head down, speak carefully, laugh when expected. You learn to live inside the acceptable, but when you light the candle each night, you think of the boy with the brooch, and the girl in the hayloft, and the quiet rebellion of loving without permission, and you wonder who the real sinners are. You wake to the sound of a goat coughing. This is not unusual. What is unusual is the man standing over your bed, holding a roasted dove in one hand and a jug of something steaming in the other. He's wearing a fur-trimmed hat, 3 rings, and a look of supreme confidence that suggests he's recently read half a medical text and now believes he understands the entire human body. You blink, ask if you're dying, and he replies, "Not yet, but your humors are deeply confused." He's the town's physician, though no one remembers exactly when or how he earned that title. He once cured a man's gout by bleeding him until he fainted, and then blaming the recovery on divine intervention. Today, apparently, he's here to explain that you're barren. You hadn't realized you were trying for children. He doesn't care. It's your civic duty, he says, and also your womb may be too cold, or possibly too dry, or maybe filled with melancholy frogs. The diagnosis is unclear. He launches into a lecture about female pleasure, which you absolutely did not ask for. According to him, and at least 3 monks with no known experience women, must achieve a joyful tremor of the womb in order to conceive. This is not only medical fact, but theological necessity. He cites Saint Albinus, who once wrote that barren women could be cured by laughter, vigorous dancing, and being read poetry by someone with a strong chin. He recommends a series of treatments. The dove, for one, roasted then rubbed on the belly while chanting. You ask why a dove. He says because rabbits are too fast and cats too rude. You try not to imagine the research that led to this conclusion. Then there's the tonic made of boiled lavender, fennel seeds, and what he vaguely refers to as the essence of stag ambition. You don't ask questions. You've learned better. The final step, he insists, is singing. Not by you. That would unbalance the stars. No, someone must sing to you while you recline, preferably in a gown made of linen soaked in moonlight. The song should be about harvests, fertility, or ideally, a particularly handsome plowman. There's one written by a nun who left the convent after allegedly being visited by an angel with strong hands. He offers to hum it. You decline. Still, the entire village is suddenly interested in your theoretical infertility. Women bring you herbs. A man from the next hamlet sends a note offering to inspire your joy for the good of the community. The priest suggests prayer, then winces when reminded of the singing. Everyone is very invested in your non-existent baby. You begin attending the weekly gatherings out of spite. The physician leads them, of course. He lectures about the dangers of celibacy and the risk of wandering wombs, which, if not anchored by regular affection, may float into the throat and cause hysteria or overly sharp opinions. You meet a woman there named Clara. She has 8 children and a smile that suggests she's seen the world and laughed at it. She tells you, over wine made from questionable berries, that none of the theories work, that babies arrive when they want and not a moment before, and that the physician once tried to court her by writing a sonnet about spleens. Later, you see the physician again. He's arguing with the baker about whether intimacy during a full moon leads to twins or madness. You slip away before he notices you. Back home, you light a candle, eat the roasted dove because it's actually quite good, and hum a song about a plowman with very strong hands, just in case. Not because you believe it, but because, frankly, it's less ridiculous than most of what you've heard that day. The church bell tolls just before sunrise, a sound so solemn and judgmental you almost feel guilty for sleeping horizontal. Outside, the sky is smeared in pre-dawn gray, and inside the chapel, the air is heavy with incense and contradictions. The priest's voice rises above the coughing and shuffling, a mighty boom proclaiming the flesh to be a filthy, shameful vessel, a leaky jar of temptation that must be corked with guilt and fear. You sit near the back, on a bench polished smooth by centuries of twitching bottoms, and listen as Father Lucian delivers his 5th sermon this month on the evils of lust. He's got a favorite phrase now, the rot of the loins, which he says slowly, like a baker kneading dough, really letting the syllables stretch. It's hard to concentrate, because the baker's wife in the front row is mouthing the words along with him like it's her favorite hymn. He thunders on about fornication, about how even married couples should tread gently in the orchard of flesh, a metaphor he does not explain but everyone pretends to understand. When he says this, a farmhand 2 rows up sneezes in a way that suspiciously resembles a snort. By the time the sermon ends, your ears are ringing and your thighs are numb. You step outside, blinking against the sudden brightness, and are nearly trampled by the line forming at the side door. It's the queue for linen, blessings, and it stretches down the chapel steps like a pilgrimage of shame and scented candles. You hadn't realized bed linens could be sanctified. They can. For a modest fee and a quick prayer, Father Lucian will bless the sheets that were used, or are about to be used, for marital union. There's even a ranking system. 1 prayer if you merely intend to conceive, 2 if you hope to avoid conception, but want to remain spiritually tidy, and 3 if you're feeling guilty, but not enough to stop. The baker's wife is near the front, holding a neatly folded square of fabric wrapped in ribbon. You're fairly sure you saw that same fabric drying on her hedge this morning, fluttering alongside a pair of suspiciously masculine hose. Later that afternoon, you find yourself invited summoned to a church-hosted gathering. It's called a Circle of Sanctity, which sounds like a knitting group, but involves a great deal of whispering and fervent nodding. It's led by Sister Adeline, whose eyebrows alone could shame a sinner into celibacy. She speaks of purity and control, of denying the body so the soul may rise, of hunger being holy and desire a distraction. Then she passes around a small tin of scented oil and instructs everyone to rub it into their wrists before bed to cleanse dreams of impure visitations. Someone asks if it also works on goats. No one laughs. But here's the thing. You know for a fact that Sister Adeline receives secret deliveries of rose water every Tuesday from a man with shoulders that don't quite fit in the chapel pews. You've seen him. He whistles. You also know that Father Lucian's sermons are occasionally interrupted by coughs that sound suspiciously like moans from the vestry wall. Once, a novice monk emerged with his robe inside out and a dazed expression like he'd just seen heaven and wasn't entirely sure it was metaphorical. And still, the crowd gathers, week after week, mouths open for wafer. Warning. Because the church may wag its finger at the body, but it never quite lets go of the sheets. You watch, you listen, and you learn to nod at the right times. You light the candles, say the words, and fold your linens very precisely, just in case. But when night comes, and the fire is low, and the town is silent except for the rustle of leaves and distant giggles that are definitely not demonic, you remember what the sermons try to scrub away. The body doesn't ask for permission. It remembers. The merchant arrives with spices, silks, and a twinkle in his eye that suggests he's seen things no one in your village has names for. He smells of saffron and sweat, rides a horse that looks too tired to judge anyone, and sets up his wares under the old fig tree like a prophet of sin in patchwork robes. Children gather first, drawn by the bright cloth and carved toys. Then the women come, pretending to care about peppercorns while clearly waiting for the stories. By dusk, even the priest's niece is lingering nearby, tucking a veil tighter each time she pretends not to listen. You try not to be curious. Curiosity, after all, is how Eve got in trouble and how the stable boy lost an eyebrow. But when the merchant speaks, it's with the kind of voice that makes the wind hush so it can listen too. He begins with India. He says there are books there, entire books, with illustrations, diagrams, and something called the suspended peacock. He says couples read them aloud like prayers, and sometimes with more enthusiasm. In these lands, bodies are not hushed. They are studied, celebrated, and occasionally bent in ways that would make the village midwife faint or take notes. You glance around. The baker's apprentice has stopped chewing. The widowed herb seller is staring straight ahead, lips parted slightly like a statue carved in shock. Someone whispers, "What's a peacock?" The merchant smiles like he knows but won't explain without coin. Then he moves, on to Egypt, where perfumes are mixed with crushed rose petals and amber, and lovers write each other poetry on slips of parchment hidden in bread loaves. You're skeptical until he produces one, crumbling at the edges but unmistakably inscribed with what appears to be an ode to someone's left thigh. By the time he gets to the lands beyond the sea places with names like Andalusia and Samarkand, the crowd has thickened. People are leaning in. A grandmother holds her rosary like it's both shield and antenna. No one breathes when he describes the bathhouses, tiled rooms filled with steam, laughter, and people rubbing each other with oils scented like fruit and sin. You hear someone gasp behind you when he says in some cities, men and women share these baths. A goat bleats, offended. Of course, not everything he says can be true. Surely no one actually keeps a pearl in their mouth during intimacy to preserve sweetness. Surely people don't hang from silk ropes for fun. Surely there aren't entire festivals in the East where the only clothing worn is confidence. Still, there's a part of you that wonders, not just if the stories are real, But if the people who live them are happier, freer, less worried about bed linens, feast days, or the precise position of a saint's eyebrow, that night, as the village sleeps and the merchant snores under his wagon, you walk to the edge of town. The moon is high, the fields smell of earth and ripening things. You think about peacocks, about steam and silk and poetry tucked in pastries. You think about how many lives are out there, strange, colorful, loud, and how small yours feels by comparison. You don't envy them, but you do wonder what it would be like to kiss someone not with duty, but with delight, not to prove anything, not to conceive, just to taste the world the merchant spoke of. Somewhere, a rooster crows prematurely. You shake your head, laugh under your breath, and head home before anyone sees you smiling. Whispers begin in the least expected places, between herbs, in the apothecary's booth, behind cloisters, under cloaks, where midwives keep their records not in ink, but memory. They speak not loudly, not yet, but with the weight of 1,000 births and the ache of watching what happens when truths are strangled by tradition. You hear it first when Greta, the midwife with hands like leather and a stare that unmakes men, tosses out the old advice about praying for male heirs and instead mutters something about the moon, nutrition, and maybe, just maybe, listening to women for once. You think she's joking, but then she starts keeping notes. Next comes the poet. He used to write the usual drivel: hair like wheat, breasts like apples, obedience like rain, expected, unremarkable, tedious. But something shifts. Maybe he's heartbroken, maybe he's finally read something with spine, but suddenly he's composing lines about a woman's voice, not her silence, about wanting her laughter more than her dowry. It's jarring. The village blacksmith reads one of the verses aloud and asks if the poet's gone soft. The poet shrugs and says, "Maybe love doesn't have to be a performance of property anymore." The blacksmith replies with a grunt and then quietly asks for a copy. It's not a revolution, not yet. It's more like bread rising slow, invisible, and dependent on heat no one sees until it's too late to stop. Girls whisper that maybe bleeding every month isn't a punishment, but just part of being alive. Wives admit to each other that they're tired of pretending satisfaction is reserved for men. One even says, during confession, that she thinks God might actually want her to enjoy herself. The priest coughs, drops his chalice, and declares Mass over. Meanwhile, the scribes in the monastery start documenting herbs not just for ailments of the liver, but for ailments of the heart. An unmarried scholar is caught sketching diagrams of this, the female body, that are suspiciously accurate and not at all titillating, just respectful. Like maybe the mystery of womanhood isn't something to fear or conquer, but understand. He's punished with double chores but offered private tutoring by 3 curious nuns. The elders frown, of course. They cling to their scrolls and sermons, reminding everyone that order must be maintained. But order is hard to maintain when the tailor's daughter runs off with a woman from the next village and the world doesn't end. Harder still when the baker's wife returns from childbirth and announces she delivered squatting, not screaming on her back like cattle, and that it hurt less and felt more hers. Change comes in meals, in laughter, in shared glances that last just a beat too long. In public, nothing shifts. People still bow to saints and fear the devil. But in private, sheets are not just for sleeping, and touches are not just obligations. There's a sense now thin, like steam, that perhaps desire doesn't have to be sinful to be sacred. You catch yourself thinking differently. Not wildly, not recklessly, but differently. You read the old tales and start noticing the women who were written out. You see the men who wanted more than heirs, who painted their lovers with words instead of commands. You wonder what your grandmother would say if she knew the world was softening around its sharpest edges. At the spring festival, the dancers wear masks as usual, but one couple doesn't. They hold hands, look each other in the eye, and move like they're not hiding anything. It's oddly scandalous. and beautiful. No one says a word. That night a storm rolls in, but it doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like the sky applauding something too long silenced. And somewhere, tucked between pages of dogma and duty, a seed splits open. Not loudly, but it grows. The candles are nearly stubs now, low wax rivers melting into themselves, like history folding into modernity. You sit with a belly full of bread, brain full of contradictions, and wonder how a civilization so obsessed with sin also managed to invent lace underwear and confession booths in the same century. You've walked through brothels blessed by bishops and churches that forbade bathing, lest it awaken lust, and somewhere along the way, it became impossible to separate faith from flesh without tying your brain into a knot. Now you're in a world with electric lights and dating apps, where people still panic about desire like it's a wild animal that needs taming, not understanding. And you think of them, the ones before you, stumbling through pleasure with rules that made no sense, and rituals that somehow made things worse. They had saints for stamina, trials for impotence, and chants to keep demons from nesting in your loins. Yet half the population was still getting pregnant in haylofts by men named Ulrich, who owned 3 teeth and a goat. You scroll through screens now instead of parchment, but the messages haven't evolved much. Magazines shout about 10 tricks to keep him interested, and influencers whisper about chastity like it's a skincare routine. Somewhere, someone is still blaming a woman's neckline for his bad decisions. And you realize that while the ink has dried and the robes have turned into blazers, the tug of war between desire and decorum is as breathlessly confused as ever. You remember the girl who burned herbs under her bed to make a boy love her. They called it witchcraft. Now it's called manifesting. You remember a monk who wrote poetry so rapturous it could raise eyebrows and something else, and centuries later, it's sold as merch on Etsy. You think of the midwife who said maybe, just maybe, pleasure could be mutual, and you wonder if she'd laugh or cry at modern headlines debating whether women really enjoy sex or are just exceptionally polite. In the background, a podcast host analyzes Victorian vibrators while sipping chai. Someone on the internet argues whether posting thirst traps is empowering or just medieval shame in a new font. And you sit there, somewhere between entertained and exhausted, because the conversation never ends. It just changes costumes. But still, in quiet corners, something honest flickers. It's in the way someone touches your face without expectation, in the awkward stammer of first-time courage, when a person admits they want to be wanted, in the softness of a shared laugh after bad sex, in the silence between breaths, where no one's pretending to be holy or broken, just human. You think maybe that's always been the point, not the trials or sermons or the 1,000 rules enforced by people who never followed them, but the clumsy, aching, relentless attempt to connect, to be seen without performance, to love without permission. And as the last candle sighs its final breath, you realize the echoes are not ghosts. They are reminders that we've always been this strange, this hungry, this hopeful.